Wyoming Territory, May of 1879, and the wind howled across the plains like it was mourning something lost. Colter Vaughn sat on the edge of the bunkhouse steps, his hat low over his eyes, a rifle across his knees. He looked like a statue carved out of dust and silence, except for the way his fingers twitched every so often, like they were itching to draw. The sun was just starting to dip behind the hills, throwing long shadows over the Circle V ranch. He did not belong here anymore, not since the fight started brewing in Dry Creek, and not since the letter came. The letter was folded in his coat pocket, worn soft from how often he had read it. Written in hurried script, the ink smudged at the edges. He knew every word by heart now. "Colter, I do not want you to fight them. I want you to come home, not for pride, not for vengeance, for me, for us. Please." Zadie, he had not seen her in 2 years, not since she left Dry Creek with her 2 kids and no husband left to speak of. Not since she stopped waiting for him to choose her over his need to settle every wrong with a gun. A door creaked behind him. "You going to Dry Creek tomorrow?" asked Ellie, one of the ranch hands. "They say that bastard Dalton's bringing in men from Cheyenne." "It will be blood, Colter." Colter stood up slow, brushing dust from his coat. "Not going," he said. Ellie stared. "You sure? You could take Dalton with one hand tied, I am sure." "Why?" Colter looked out toward the open country. "Because she asked me to come home instead." The train into Laramie was late, and Zadie Lowell had been standing on the platform with her daughter, Flora, and her son, Finn, for nearly an hour. Flora was 6, quiet and sharp-eyed. Finn was 4, already muddy from whatever he had gotten into during the wait. Zadie's hands were red from holding them back from the edges of the platform. She had not seen Colter since before her husband died of fever. Before she buried what was left of her dreams under long nights with no money and 2 children who needed more than she had. But she had written to him anyway. She still remembered the way he used to look at her when they were 16 and thought they might have forever. She remembered how he walked away the first time, chasing a fight that had nothing to do with him. This time she was not asking, she was hoping. The train came in with a whistle that rattled the bones. The doors opened, people spilled out, soldiers, miners, a pair of women in travel dresses. And then he stepped off with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, dust on his boots and his eyes searching until they found hers. Colter Vaughn stopped in the middle of the platform like he had been hit. Zadie's breath caught. She did not move, neither did he. Then Finn yelled, "Mama, is that him?" And Colter blinked just once like something in him cracked clean open. He walked toward them. Zadie knelt to wipe dirt from Finn's cheek as Colter stopped in front of her. "You came," she said. "You asked," he said. Flora looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "Are you the cowboy?" Colter crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. "I guess I am." Finn stared at his boots. "You got a horse?" "Sure do. Can we ride it?" Colter looked past them at Zadie. "That is up to your mama." Zadie's throat felt tight. She nodded once. The house was a small cabin at the edge of a dry creek 3 miles from town. Zadie had patched it herself when the roof fell in last spring. It was not much, but it was hers. Colter unpacked his things into the barn, never asking for more than space and time. He fixed the window shutter that always banged in the wind. He helped Flora hang a swing from the old cottonwood. He taught Finn how to brush down the mare without losing a finger. He watched Zadie when he thought she would not notice, but she did. One night, after the children were asleep, she stepped out onto the porch where he was oiling his saddle. The moon was full and the air smelled like sage and wood smoke. "You are not going back to Dry Creek, are you?" she asked. "No, you could win." "I know." She sat down beside him. "So why?" He looked at her, eyes soft in the moonlight. "Because you asked me not to." The next week, a letter came from Dry Creek. Dalton had been shot dead in a gambling dispute. The fight ended before it ever began. Colter had not lifted a finger. He read the letter once, then tossed it into the stove. Zadie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That was it? That was it. You are not disappointed?" "No." She stepped closer. Why? He looked at her fully then, and something passed between them that had no words. Because I am where I want to be, he said. Zadie's breath caught. And where is that? With you. She reached for his hand. It was calloused and warm. He held on, tight. Like he had no intention of ever letting go, and she believed him. By the second week of June, the cottonwoods had leafed out full and green, their branches heavy with the quiet breath of summer. The air carried the smell of horse sweat and creek mud, and the heat made everything slower. Days unfolded in long stretches, marked by chores, meals, and the hush of dusk settling over the valley. Colter had taken to rising before the sun. He'd slip out to the pasture before the rooster called, mend fence or check the water troughs. Zadie watched him sometimes from the kitchen window, the way he moved with a kind of worn patience, like he no longer needed to prove anything. One morning, as she kneaded dough at the table, Flora padded in barefoot, her braid coming loose. "Is he gonna stay?" she asked without looking up. Zadie let the question hang a moment. "What makes you ask that?" He fixed the door to the smokehouse. "Papa never fixed it." Flora's tone was flat, but her hands kept worrying the hem of her nightgown. Zadie dusted her fingers clean. "He didn't come here to leave." Flora nodded once, as if that settled something she'd been carrying. Later, Zadie found Colter in the barn, brushing down the mule. She leaned against the stall rail, arms crossed. Flora asked if you were staying. He didn't pause the brush. "What you tell her? That you didn't come here to leave." He set the brush down, met her eyes. "I didn't." Zadie studied him a beat. "You ever think about what you'd have done if that letter never came?" His jaw shifted. "I try not to." She stepped closer, her hand resting on the stall door. "I do." He watched her quiet. "I thought maybe you'd gotten yourself killed," she said, "or married." He shook his head once. "Neither, just took too long to figure out what mattered." Zadie lowered her gaze. "I was angry at you a long time. I earned that." She looked up. "You planning to keep earning it?" "No," he said. "I'm planning to earn something better." The ache that lived just beneath her ribs eased just a little. That afternoon, Colter took Finn out to the ridge west of the creek where the pine gave way to open rock. They tracked a rabbit for near an hour, though the boy's laugh scattered every creature within a quarter mile. Colter showed him how to look for droppings, how to find which way the grass bent. Finn listened like it was the most important thing he'd ever learned. When they came back, Zadie was hanging clothes on the line, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a streak of flour on her cheek. Colter glanced at her once, then handed Finn the canteen and knelt to check the boy's bootlaces. "You hungry?" she called. "I am," Finn said, bouncing on his toes. Colter stood and met her eyes. "I could eat." That night, after the children were in bed, Zadie sat on the porch step with a basket of mending. The oil lamp beside her glowed soft, casting long shadows across the boards. Colter stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "You always sew by moonlight?" he asked. "Only when something's torn." He nodded toward the basket. "That shirt of mine," she held it up, "tore it on the fence gate." "You didn't say. Didn't think you'd want to be sewing after supper." "I don't mind." He sat beside her, leaning back against the post. "You always this stubborn," she gave him a glance. "You always this slow," he laughed under his breath, low and rough. "Fair enough." They sat quiet a while. The night was thick with the sound of crickets and the occasional creak of settling wood. "You still sleep with your boots on?" she asked. He looked down at his feet. "Not since I got here." "Good." Another silence settled between them, not heavy, just full. "You ever wonder what it'd be like if we'd done this different?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I used to, but now I just think about how not to waste what's left." Zadie turned to him. "And what is left?" He met her eyes, steady. "Enough time if we don't run from it." She set the mending aside and reached out, her fingers brushing his. He didn't move, just let her hand rest there against his. "I'm not running anymore," she said. "Neither am I," he said. The wind stirred the laundry on the line, and somewhere in the dark, a night bird called. Colter shifted his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Zadie leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and for the first time in years she felt still. The days began to take on shape, like furrows drawn deep and straight through warm earth. By late June, the sun hung longer in the sky and the fields behind the Lowell house shimmered gold by late afternoon. Zadie had taken to planting a second bed of beans near the shed, and Colter spent mornings cutting posts to fence in a second paddock. He didn't ask if he could stay. She didn't ask if he meant to leave. Neither needed to. One evening, after Colter came back from hauling water from the creek, he found Zadie seated by the kitchen table, her sewing basket forgotten beside her. A letter lay open in her lap. He stood in the doorway, wiping sweat from the back of his neck. "Bad news," she folded the letter without meeting his eyes. "My sister's husband passed." He stepped inside, slow. "The one in Colorado," she nodded. "She's got 4 little ones now, no land of their own. She's asking if I can take the eldest girl for a time. Just till they get steady." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "You want to?" Zadie looked down at her hands. "I want to help, but it's not just me anymore." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're not asking permission." "No." "But I am asking if you think we can manage." He reached for her hand. "We can." She watched him a long moment. "You sure?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." That night, after the oil lamp was turned low, he sat outside under the cottonwood and listened to the wind pass through the leaves. He thought about a girl he'd never met, about what it meant to make room in a house already full of ghosts and scrape together peace. The next morning, Flora helped Zadie pack a parcel of bread and dried plums for the journey Colter would take to meet the stagecoach halfway. Finn handed him a carved horse he'd whittled from scrap pine and said, "Give it to her so she don't feel scared." Colter tucked it into his saddlebags without a word. He rode out before sunrise, the light just beginning to touch the ridge. Zadie watched until he vanished into the trees, her arms wrapped around herself though the morning was warm. 3 days passed before he returned, a thin girl of perhaps 10 riding pillion behind him. She clung to him without speaking, her face drawn and sunburnt, her eyes too old. Zadie met them at the gate. "You must be Ruth." The girl nodded, silent. Colter dismounted, helping her down gently. "She didn't say much on the ride. I wouldn't expect her to." They brought her inside, gave her the cot near the hearth. Flora offered her a ribbon from her hair without being asked. Finn showed her where the frogs hid behind the rain barrel. By nightfall, she still hadn't spoken, but when Zadie tucked her in, she didn't look away. Later, Colter stepped into the kitchen where Zadie was washing the supper things. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "She'll be all right," he said. "She will," she said, not turning. He waited. Zadie dried her hands on her apron. "You didn't have to go all that way." "I know." She looked at him then, the lamplight soft on her face. "But you did." He stepped closer. "You wanted her safe." "I did." They stood there a moment. Then she reached for the side of his neck, let her hand rest there. "I'm not used to this," she said. He tilted his head just slightly into her touch. "To what?" "To having someone who stays." He didn't answer with words. He leaned forward slow and pressed his forehead to hers. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. The next morning, Ruth was sitting at the edge of the porch, her knees drawn up, when Colter came back from the barn. She pointed at the sky without speaking. He followed her gaze. A hawk circled high above the fields, its wings stretched wide in the pale blue. "They don't flap much," she said finally, voice rough from disuse. "No," he said, "they ride the wind." She nodded like that made sense. Zadie stepped out with a mug of warm milk and set it beside her. "You slept a little longer today." Ruth picked up the mug, careful not to spill. "I didn't dream." Zadie sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her brow. "That's something." Colter leaned against the porch post. "You ever ride before, Ruth?" She shook her head. "Well," he said, "we'll have to fix that." Zadie looked at him, her eyes soft and sure. He looked back, steady. They didn't need to speak it out loud. Everything that needed saying had already settled between them like dust after a long ride. They were building something here, and no one was leaving. July heat settled heavy on the land, pressing down with a weight that turned breath shallow and made every task feel longer than it was. The earth cracked in places where the creek had pulled back, and the wind carried more dust than relief. Zadie kept the shutters drawn through the worst of the afternoons, and the children learned to move like shadows, soft-footed, quiet, always with their eyes on the horizon. Colter had begun carving out a lean-to behind the barn, a place to store the tools that no longer fit beneath the porch. He worked shirtless in the heat, back browned from sun, the corded muscle in his arms taut from every swing of the hatchet. He didn't ask for help, but when Ruth came out with a tin of well water, he took it from her with a nod. After she'd gone, Colter sat on the stump he'd been using as a sawhorse and stared out toward the tree line. The silence of the place had begun to take hold of him, not in a way that made him restless, but the opposite. It was like something inside him had gone still finally. That evening, after supper, Zadie found him setting out a coil of rope and checking the cinch on the mare's saddle. She leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, going somewhere. He didn't glance up. Eastfield thought I saw signs of a mountain cat. She stepped closer. You think it'll come near the house? Not yet, but I'd rather not wait until it does. Zadie reached for the curry comb on the wall and began brushing the mare's flank while he worked. You always this careful? I used to be reckless, he said, tightening the strap. Didn't think much past the next mile. Not anymore, he paused. Not since I started building instead of leaving. She didn't say anything, but her hand slowed on the mare's back, the motion turning thoughtful. He looked at her then, his voice lower. You sleep lighter than you let on. Zadie didn't meet his eyes. I had to. He nodded once, then turned back to the saddle. I'll be back before sun up. She stepped in front of him before he could mount. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not. She reached up, brushing a piece of grass from his collarbone. Then come home even if you don't find anything. He touched her wrist gently. I will. Before dawn, he returned with a single track marked in dust and nothing more. He didn't say a word about it, just stabled the mare and poured himself coffee before the others woke. 2 days passed quiet. Then on the third, Ruth came running in from the orchard, her breath caught in her chest. There's a man by the fence, she said, eyes wide. He's just standing there. Colter met Zadie's gaze, then stepped out without a word. She followed close, keeping Flora and Finn behind her. The man was lean, older, with a limp in his right leg and a rifle slung loose at his side. His boots were worn through at the toe, and his coat was patched in more places than it wasn't. Colter stopped short of the fence. Can I help you? The man's eyes darted between them. Heard Vaughn was out this way, didn't believe it. You heard wrong, Colter said, voice even. The man took a step forward. Dalton's brother's been asking around. Word is you walked away from Dry Creek before the dust settled. Zadie stepped closer, her voice low. He's not looking for that anymore. The man's lip curled. Funny, the way folks talk. Like maybe you lost your nerve. Colter didn't move. You got business here. The man looked past him toward the children gathered in the doorway. His eyes lingered too long. Colter's hand dropped to the knife at his belt. I asked you a question. The man raised both palms. Just passing through. Then keep passing. The man hesitated, then turned and limped back down the road. Colter watched until he disappeared beyond the bend, then turned back to Zadie. You knew him? She asked. No, he said. But I know what kind of man he is. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, Zadie lit a single candle and sat at the kitchen table. Colter stood in the doorway, arms crossed. You think more will come? She asked. Maybe. She looked up at him. Will you run if they do? No, he said. But I won't meet them halfway either. Zadie folded her hands in her lap. I spent a long time wishing someone would stay and not bring trouble with them. I'm not trouble anymore. She rose and came to stand in front of him. No, she said. You're not. He reached for her hand, slow. I meant it when I said I was done fighting. She stepped in close, her voice steady. Then I'll stop expecting you to leave. He drew her into his arms, letting her settle against his chest like she'd belonged there all along. And when she looked up, he kissed her, soft and certain. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and the land held its peace. Inside, they stood wrapped in the quiet promise of what they'd chosen. Not a beginning, not an end, just the middle of something worth staying for. August arrived dry and bright, the land brittle beneath a sky too wide and hot. The wind had gone still, and the only sound most afternoons was the creak of the well bucket or the low murmur of bees in the squash blossoms. Ruth had taken to reading aloud on the porch, her voice slow and steady, while Flora and Finn lay sprawled beside her, listening with the kind of quiet that only came when something felt safe. Colter had begun setting stones for a smokehouse, working in the early light before the heat grew thick. The work was slow, but he moved with purpose, stacking each stone with the same care he once gave to the load of a rifle. Zadie watched him from the kitchen window, wiping her hands on her apron without realizing she was smiling. That evening she brought him a basin of cool water and a bundle of clean cloth. He'd scraped his forearm lifting a beam, and though he said it didn't need tending, she knelt beside him anyway. "I can manage," he said, though he didn't pull away. "I know," she said, dipping the cloth and pressing it gently to the raw skin. "But I want to." He looked at her, his voice quieter. "You're not afraid I'll bring more trouble?" She wrung out the cloth. "You never brought it, it followed you." "That's different." He reached for her hand then, water still dripping from his skin, and pressed it to his chest. "You still carry weight," she said. "I always will." His fingers curled around hers, but not alone. That night the wind returned. It came gentle, brushing across the land like it was reminding the world how to breathe. Zadie stood by the window, the children asleep in the next room, and watched the curtains stir. Colter came in from the barn, the scent of wood smoke on his shirt, and crossed to her without speaking. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited, his hand resting low on her back. "About the land behind the orchard," she continued. "It's good soil, better than we've got out front." Colter nodded. "We could put in corn come spring. I was thinking wheat." They stood in silence a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. "We'll try both," he said. In the morning, Zadie handed Ruth a folded paper with a list in her careful hand. "Ask Mrs. Delling for these when you go into town with Colter. She'll know." Ruth tucked the note into her coat pocket and turned to Colter, who was adjusting the wagon traces. "Are we bringing back salt, too?" "We'll see how much room we've got after the flour," he said, winking at her. Zadie watched them go, her heart steady and full in a way she hadn't known in years. Later that week, the preacher from town came out to deliver a parcel of hymn books and stayed for supper. He lingered on the porch afterward, watching the sun sink low behind the cottonwoods. "Folks say you've brought peace to this land," he said to Colter, sipping his coffee. Colter shrugged. "I haven't done much." "You stayed," the preacher said. "That's more than most." Zadie came out with a plate of late peaches and passed one to each of them. "You planning to marry her?" the preacher asked without hesitation. Colter didn't blink. "I am." Zadie looked at him, her eyes wide but calm. "You could have asked first," she said. "I was going to," Colter replied. "Just hadn't found the right words." She smiled, setting the plate down. "Try now." He stood, brushing off his trousers. "I ain't got much to offer but work and truth." "I already have both," she said. He took her hands. "Then I'll ask plain. Will you marry me, Zadie Lowell?" She nodded, her voice low. "Yes." They wed beneath the cottonwood tree 2 Sundays later, with the preacher reading from a worn leather Bible and the children dressed in their best. Ruth carried a sprig of clover tied in ribbon. Flora stood beside her mother, holding her hand tight. Finn gave Colter a rock he'd painted blue and said it was for luck. They shared stew and bread and sweet preserves afterward, and when the sun dipped low, Zadie and Colter danced slow in the dust, her bare feet brushing his boots. That night, with the house quiet and the lamp turned low, Zadie lay beside him beneath the patched quilt. "You still think of the road?" she asked softly. "Only the one that leads back here," he said. She turned toward him, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You're not the man I waited on." "No," he said, "but I'm the one who came back." She kissed him, slow and sure, and he held her close, the kind of hold that promised nothing would tear them apart again. Years passed. The wheat grew strong behind the orchard. Flora took to sketching plants in a notebook Colter helped her bind from scraps. Finn learned to shoe horses and built a water wheel with Ruth's help. Ruth stayed, even after her mother sent for her. She said she had her place now. Colter built a second room onto the house, then a third. Zadie kept the garden, humming softly to herself as she worked. They never spoke of Dry Creek again. One spring, when Colter came in from the pasture, he found Zadie in the doorway, her hands resting on the swell beneath her apron. She didn't say a word, just smiled. He crossed to her, kissed her forehead, and whispered something too soft for the children to hear. They raised their child alongside the others, the house filled with warmth and noise and the smell of bread rising. And every night, before the lamp was turned out, Colter would wrap his arm around her waist, draw her close, and breathe in the peace they'd made stone by stone, season by season. They had not been each other's first chapter, but they were the last.